What if I told you that the thing standing between you and the life you want is not laziness, not a lack of discipline, and not a shortage of time? What if the real reason you haven't started, the reason you keep circling the same dreams without ever landing on them, has nothing to do with your willpower at all? What if it turns out that the smarter you are, the harder this actually gets? Right now, there is something you want to do, something that matters deeply to you. Maybe it's a business idea you have been nursing for years. Maybe it's a book, a creative project, a skill you keep meaning to develop, or a conversation you keep postponing. You know the thing. You've thought about it 100 times. You've imagined what it would feel like to finally do it. And yet, you haven't started. And the painful part isn't even the not starting. The painful part is that you don't know why. You are not lazy. Lazy people don't lie awake at night, troubled by their own inaction. You are not stupid. In fact, I want to propose something uncomfortable. Your intelligence may be part of the problem. Here's what this book is going to do. It is going to take you inside your own brain, into the specific structures and chemical signals that are working against you every single day, and show you exactly what is happening and why. Not in vague, feel-good language. In real, honest, sometimes uncomfortable detail. And here is the one thing I need you to hold on to before we begin. The reason you haven't started has nothing to do with how much you want it. It has everything to do with what your brain has been quietly trained to fear. And that fear has a name, a mechanism, a biology, and a solution. Let's begin. Let me tell you about a man named David. David is 34 years old. He's intelligent, well-read, and genuinely talented. He has wanted to write a novel since he was 19. He has folders of notes, outlines, character sketches. He has started the first chapter 4 separate times across 4 different years. And every time, somewhere around page 3 or 4, he stops. He tells himself he needs more research. He tells himself the idea isn't ready yet. He reorganizes his files, makes a new outline, reads another book about writing. And then, very quietly, without quite deciding to, he stops again. What David cannot explain, what keeps him awake at night, is why. He doesn't feel lazy. When he's at work, he's highly capable. He meets deadlines. He solves difficult problems. He is not someone who avoids hard things in general. Only this one thing. Only the thing that matters most. David is not unusual. David is most of us. And here is the first truth I want you to understand. David's problem is not a time management problem. He has the time. It is not a motivation problem. He desperately wants this. It is not a talent problem. He has the talent. David's problem is an emotion regulation problem. That phrase, emotion regulation, is the foundation of everything in this book. And I know it might sound clinical or even a little dismissive, but stay with me, because once you truly understand what it means, it will rearrange the way you see yourself completely. Here's the basic mechanism. When David sits down to write, his brain doesn't evaluate the task and say, "This is important, let's focus." His brain evaluates the emotional experience that the task is about to produce. And that experience is uncomfortable. There's a creeping anxiety, a fear of failure, a fear that what he writes won't be good enough, a fear, hidden even deeper, that if he finishes it and it fails, he'll have no excuse left. The idea, held close and unwritten, is perfect. The written thing could be imperfect, and imperfect feels dangerous. So his brain does what brains are extraordinarily good at. It finds a way out. Not a dramatic, obvious way. A subtle, almost polite way. It suggests that maybe now isn't the right time. Maybe there's something else to check first. Maybe the idea needs a bit more development. Maybe he should just read one more relevant book before he starts. And just like that, without David quite deciding anything, the task is postponed. And the moment it's postponed, something important happens. The uncomfortable emotion disappears. The anxiety lifts. The brain registers that relief. And it files that away. Avoidance equals relief. Relief feels good. Good things get repeated. That is the avoidance loop. And once it is established, it is one of the most powerful behavioral cycles in the human nervous system. Now here is what the self-help industry usually tells people at this point. They say, be more disciplined. Set better goals. Wake up earlier. Make a schedule. Use a productivity system. And none of that is wrong exactly. But none of it targets the actual problem. Because the actual problem is not a lack of systems. It is a trained emotional response. And you cannot fix an emotional response with a calendar. What this book is going to do is go further than any productivity book you have read before. We are going to look at the neuroscience, the actual brain chemistry, the actual structures involved, in a way that makes this genuinely understandable. We are going to look at perfectionism and fear of success and fear of judgment, and the way dopamine has been hijacked by modern technology, and the surprising biology of comfort, and the way your identity quietly determines your behavior before you ever make a conscious choice. And then, crucially, we are going to talk about what actually works. Not because it sounds good in theory, because it aligns with what the brain actually needs in order to change. This is not a book about working harder. It's a book about working with your brain instead of fighting it. The philosopher William James, who was one of the founders of modern psychology, wrote something that has stayed with me. The greatest revolution of our generation is the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. He wrote that in the late 1800s, we now have neuroscience to explain exactly how it works. And that combination, ancient wisdom married to modern biology, is what this book is built on. Let's go deeper. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about something that will surprise you. We're going to explore why intelligent people, people who are genuinely talented and capable, often struggle more with procrastination than people who are less gifted. And the reason is not what you think. Chapter 1. The Invisible Prison. Why intelligent people procrastinate more. There's a joke among researchers who study procrastination. It goes like this. The people most likely to procrastinate are the people who are most likely to be giving seminars about why you shouldn't procrastinate. It's funny because it's true. Study after study has found that procrastination correlates, not inversely, but directly, with certain kinds of intelligence. Specifically, with the kind of intelligence that comes packaged with a vivid imagination, a deep sensitivity to outcomes, and a powerful ability to think in complex, multi-layered ways. In other words, your brain might be working against you precisely because it's so good. Let's unpack that carefully, because it matters. The human prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain directly behind your forehead, is responsible for what scientists call executive function. Planning, decision-making, imagining future consequences, weighing options, considering multiple paths. The more developed and active this region is, the more capable you are of sophisticated thinking. It's associated with creativity, strategic thought, and the ability to hold complex problems in mind. But here's the thing nobody tells you. A highly active prefrontal cortex doesn't just help you plan your success. It helps you plan your failure. In vivid, convincing, highly detailed technicolor. When a person with a very active prefrontal cortex contemplates starting a meaningful project, they don't just think about the first step. They simulate the entire arc. They imagine finishing, and they imagine what happens if what they finish isn't good enough. They imagine showing it to people and seeing disappointment. They imagine working for months only to discover the project was flawed from the beginning. They imagine the feedback, the comparison to others, the judgments. This is called mental simulation. And in most situations, it is an enormous cognitive advantage. It's why some people are exceptional planners, strategists, and problem solvers. But when it is aimed at the beginning of a creative or ambitious project, it produces something functionally identical to a threat. The brain's threat detection system, which we'll explore in much more detail in the next chapter, cannot fully distinguish between an imagined threat and a real one. When you vividly simulate failure, your nervous system responds as though failure is actually happening. Stress hormones are released. The amygdala activates. The body and mind prepare for something dangerous. And then, here is the crucial part. The most natural response in the world is to not begin. This is what researchers call analysis paralysis, though I think that name actually undersells what's happening. It's not just that you analyze too much. It's that your analysis generates genuine fear. And that fear is indistinguishable, at a neurological level, from fear of a physical threat. Your body cannot tell the difference between, I might fail at this creative project, and there is a predator near the water. The philosopher Blaise Pascal observed, and this was in the 17th century, that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. What he was pointing to, even without the language of neuroscience, was this exact phenomenon. The moment we are alone with a difficult task, the mind does not go quiet. It produces scenarios. It rehearses disasters. It builds cases for why now is not the right time. For a person of average intelligence or average imaginative capacity, this effect is present but manageable. They sit down to begin something, feel a mild unease, push through it, and get started. For a highly intelligent, highly imaginative person, the simulation is so vivid, so comprehensive, and so emotionally real that pushing through it requires overcoming what feels like genuine danger. This is the invisible prison, not external limitations, not other people, not circumstances. The capacity that gives you your greatest strengths has, without your permission, become a cage. Now let me add one more layer, because it gets more interesting. Highly capable people often have another trait that compounds this problem: very high standards. This is usually considered a virtue, and in many ways it is. But high standards, when combined with a vivid imagination, create a painful gap. The gap between the vision you have for your work and what you are capable of producing at the beginning. The author Ira Glass, one of the creators of the radio show This American Life, once described this gap beautifully. He said that when you begin doing creative work, you have excellent taste. You can see the difference between what is good and what is mediocre, but your skills haven't yet caught up to your taste. So you produce work, and it falls short of your vision, and that gap is painful. The natural response to that pain is to not produce work, to wait, to plan more, to research more, to think it through more carefully, to wait until the conditions are perfect and the skill level is right. But here is the truth that Glass understood and that neuroscience confirms. The only way to close that gap is to produce the work. You cannot think your way to skill. You cannot research your way to competence. The gap closes through doing, not through waiting. Every hour spent planning instead of producing is an hour that the gap remains exactly as wide as it was before. So what do you actually do about this? The practical answer is simpler than you might expect, though not easier. The key is to reduce the scope of what you are beginning until the imagined threat diminishes. Your brain is producing fear because it is simulating the entire project, the finishing, the judgment, the possibility of failure. So the solution is to give it something so small to simulate that the threat response never activates. Instead of, "I am going to write a chapter today," you say, "I am going to write 2 sentences." Instead of, "I am going to start my business," you say, "I am going to spend 20 minutes looking up how other similar businesses are structured." The goal is not impressive. The goal is invisible to the threat detection system. This is sometimes called implementation intentions in psychology, but what it really does is sidestep the part of your brain that is doing the simulating. You're not asking your nervous system to endorse the whole terrifying journey. You're asking it to approve one tiny, harmless step, and it almost always will. There is a second practice that is equally important: catching and naming the overthinking when it happens. When you notice yourself deep in analysis, deep in planning, deep in yet another round of preparation, pause and ask, what am I avoiding feeling right now? Because the overthinking is not actually about optimizing the project. It is about not sitting with the discomfort of beginning. Naming that, saying it out loud or writing it down, creates a small distance between you and the feeling. And that distance is where choice lives. The invisible prison is real, but the walls are made of thoughts, and thoughts can be seen for what they are. In the next chapter, we're going to go even deeper inside the brain, into the specific structure that is treating your most important goals as threats, and understand exactly how it learned to do that, and why it's so stubborn about continuing. Chapter 2. Your brain thinks success is dangerous. The amygdala, threat detection, and emotional avoidance. In 1953, a neurosurgeon named William Beecher Scoville removed a small, almond-shaped structure from a patient's brain on both sides. The patient's name was Henry Molaison. He would go on to be the most studied individual in the history of neuroscience. The structure Scoville removed was the hippocampus, primarily, but along with it, significant portions of what we now call the amygdala. What happened to Henry was extraordinary. He could no longer form new long-term memories. Every person he met, every event that occurred, was gone within minutes. He would read the same magazine repeatedly, startled each time by the same joke, having forgotten he'd read it before. But something else happened too. Henry lost the ability to experience fear in the normal way. Without a functioning amygdala, threats, even real, present ones, no longer registered. He was, in a very clinical sense, fearless. Now I am not telling you this because I think you should operate without fear. Fear is an essential survival mechanism. It has kept the human species alive through thousands of generations of genuine danger. The problem is not that you have an amygdala. The problem is that your amygdala is running software designed for ancient threats on a modern, complicated life. The amygdala is often called the brain's alarm system. It scans your environment and your thoughts constantly, looking for anything that resembles danger. When it finds something, it sends out a cascade of signals that prepare your body for response. Cortisol, adrenaline, heightened attention, faster heartbeat, shallow breathing. You've experienced this. It's what we call the stress response. Here is the critical insight for our purposes. The amygdala cannot fully distinguish between threats to your physical safety and threats to your psychological safety. Your identity, your reputation, your self-image. The amygdala treats damage to these things as danger. Real danger. Survival-level danger. This makes a particular kind of sense when you understand the evolutionary context. For most of human history, social rejection was genuinely life-threatening. A person cast out from their tribe, humiliated in front of the group, deemed incompetent or worthless by their community, that person's survival was genuinely in question. The tribe was shelter, food, protection. To lose standing in the tribe was to lose safety itself. So the amygdala learned to treat social and psychological threats with the same urgency as physical ones. And that learning is baked into us. It is not something we consciously choose. It is not a character flaw. It is hundreds of thousands of years of survival engineering. Now bring that forward to today. You are sitting at your desk. You want to begin something important, a project that matters. And the moment you contemplate beginning, your amygdala scans ahead. It reads the emotional territory of this task. It detects possibility of failure, possibility of judgment, possibility of looking foolish, possibility of wasted effort, possibility of exposing the gap between who you want to be and who you actually are. And it sounds the alarm. Not dramatically, not with sirens. Quietly. You feel it as a subtle anxiety, a pulling back, a sudden interest in something easier. A vague sense that now is not quite the right time. The body responds gently, just enough tension in the chest, just enough restlessness, to make the task feel uncomfortable. And then the prefrontal cortex, the rational, planning part of your brain, receives that signal. And instead of overriding it, it does something very human. It generates reasons. It constructs a logical case for why the avoidance makes sense. I need more information. I should plan this better. I'll be in a better headspace next week. The conditions aren't right. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote, with remarkable self-awareness, that there is no man so good that if he submitted all his actions and thoughts to the scrutiny of the laws, he would not deserve hanging 10 times in his life. What he was pointing to was our capacity for self-deception, our ability to construct narratives that make our avoidance sound perfectly reasonable. The rational mind, in service of the emotional brain, can build a fortress of justification for any amount of avoidance. And from inside that fortress, everything looks logical. This is why you can spend an entire afternoon convincing yourself you were being productive, when in fact you were engaged in something we will explore more deeply in Chapter 5, the elaborate art of going nowhere while appearing busy. But let's stay here for a moment, because understanding the amygdala's role in avoidance reveals something counterintuitive and important. Emotional avoidance is not a symptom of weakness. It is a symptom of a functioning brain doing its job aggressively well. Your amygdala is working overtime to protect you. The problem is that it has mislabeled your goals as threats. And here is the piece of information that shifts everything. The amygdala responds to what is familiar and what is unfamiliar. Familiar things are registered as safe. Unfamiliar things are registered as potentially dangerous, because in the ancient environment, unfamiliarity was often a prelude to threat. A new part of the forest might contain predators. A stranger might be hostile. Your meaningful work, the project, the creative goal, the business, the relationship you want to build, is unfamiliar territory. Not just in the practical sense, but in the emotional sense. The version of you that succeeds at this, that finishes it, that puts it into the world, that version doesn't exist yet. And the path to becoming that person runs directly through territory your brain has never experienced before. Unfamiliar. Potentially dangerous. Avoid. Now here is the practical truth. You cannot eliminate the amygdala response. You cannot think your way to fearlessness. But you can do something that is arguably more useful. You can make the unfamiliar familiar in small, safe doses. Neuroscience has a term for this: extinction learning. When you expose yourself repeatedly to something that triggers fear and nothing catastrophic happens, the amygdala gradually recalibrates. It updates its threat assessment. Over time, the response diminishes. This is why the prescription is not push through your fear. That approach treats fear as an obstacle to overcome through force, which usually produces more tension and avoidance. The prescription is shrink the exposure until the fear is manageable, then act in the presence of that small fear, then let the brain update. In practical terms, write one paragraph, not one chapter. Make one phone call, not the entire pitch. Open the file and read what you already have, not write 5 new pages. These tiny acts of engagement teach the amygdala that the territory is safe. That beginning does not lead to catastrophe. That the unfamiliar can become familiar without disaster. It sounds small. It sounds almost insultingly simple. But this is the mechanism. This is how the prison is dismantled. Not by blowing up the walls, but by walking through the door a little more each day until walking through the door is no longer frightening at all. And that brings us to the next question, which is arguably the most counterintuitive one in this entire book. Why does avoidance feel so good? That question opens up a dark and fascinating door. Because once you understand what your brain is actually getting from procrastination, you'll see why willpower alone can never be enough to defeat it. Chapter 3. The Addiction to Relief. Why avoidance feels rewarding. In the 1950s, 2 researchers at McGill University made an accidental discovery that would eventually reshape our understanding of human motivation, addiction, and behavior. James Olds and Peter Milner were conducting experiments on rat brains, trying to understand the role of certain neural pathways. By accident, they implanted an electrode in the part of the brain now known as the nucleus accumbens, the core of the brain's reward circuitry. They then gave the rats a lever they could press to stimulate this region directly. The rats would not stop pressing the lever. They pressed it in preference to food, in preference to water, in preference to sleep. Some pressed it hundreds of times an hour until they physically collapsed from exhaustion. They would ignore other rats, ignore everything, in single-minded pursuit of that lever. What Olds and Milner had discovered, though they didn't have the full language for it yet, was the dopamine system. Dopamine is not, as it is popularly described, the pleasure chemical. That is a simplification that has done a lot of damage to our understanding. Dopamine is more accurately the anticipation chemical, the seeking chemical, the this is important, pursue it chemical. It is released not just when we receive a reward, but when we anticipate one. And it is released powerfully when we escape something unpleasant. That last part is the critical piece for our purposes. When you are facing a task that makes you uncomfortable, when the amygdala has flagged it as threatening, and your stress response is quietly humming, and you decide, consciously or not, to not do the task right now, your brain experiences relief. The threat perception diminishes. The stress hormones drop. The tension in your chest releases. And at that moment, your dopamine system registers something important. A negative state was removed. Negative reinforcement, in the technical sense, not punishment, but the removal of something unpleasant. And that is powerfully, persistently rewarding. Here is the mechanism in plain language. Procrastination feels good, not in a dramatic, exciting way. In a quiet, soothing, immediate way. The moment you decide you don't have to deal with the difficult thing right now, you feel better. And that feeling of better is registered by the reward system as a success. Something worked. The brain makes a note. Do that again. This is not a metaphor. This is chemistry. The avoidance relief loop runs on the same neurological infrastructure as drug use, gambling, and social media scrolling. The substance or behavior differs. The underlying mechanism is identical. And here is the really uncomfortable truth. Every time you successfully avoid the thing that makes you uncomfortable, you make it easier to avoid next time. The neural pathway that runs uncomfortable feeling avoid relief reward gets a little bit stronger. It myelinates. It becomes more automatic. What started as a choice becomes a reflex. Naval Ravikant, the entrepreneur and philosopher, has observed that desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want. But what most people miss is the corollary. Avoidance is a contract you make with yourself to feel better right now, in exchange for feeling worse about yourself over time. And because the relief is immediate and the cost is deferred, the brain prefers the contract every time. Let me give you a picture of what this looks like in practice. Imagine you have a project due. Let's say a presentation you need to prepare. You sit down in the morning to work on it. You open the document. The familiar anxiety begins. The cursor blinks. You type a sentence. It's not quite right. You delete it. You retype it. Still not right. The discomfort builds. And then your phone buzzes. Or you remember an email you haven't replied to. Or you suddenly feel like the desk needs to be tidier before you can focus properly. And you attend to that. And the discomfort dissolves. You have just completed one cycle of the loop. And the loop has just gotten a little bit stronger. The next time you sit down to work on the presentation, the pull toward avoidance will arrive a little sooner. The justifications will come a little faster. The alternative activities will feel a little more compelling. This is why procrastination is not a character problem. It is a learning problem. Specifically, you have learned, through hundreds or thousands of repetitions, that avoidance is reliably effective at producing immediate relief. You have trained yourself into a pattern that, from the brain's perspective, is completely rational. Here's the other dimension of this that doesn't get discussed enough. What you replace the uncomfortable task with also matters enormously. If your avoidance activity is genuinely pleasurable, watching something entertaining, eating something you enjoy, talking with someone you love, then the dopamine contrast is clear. The avoided task feels hard. The replacement activity feels good. The brain draws a vivid lesson. But if your avoidance activity is something mildly stimulating and somewhat numbing, scrolling social media, browsing news, checking messages, something fascinating happens. These activities are not deeply pleasurable. They are just enough stimulation to prevent you from feeling the discomfort of the avoided task, without providing genuine satisfaction. They occupy the mind just enough to prevent it from returning to what it actually needs to do. This is why so many people describe finishing a procrastination session feeling vaguely worse than before. Not because the avoidance failed, because the replacement activity provided just enough relief to make the avoidance work, but not enough reward to make the time feel well spent. You've escaped the discomfort, but you haven't gone anywhere good. So what do? The first step is one that sounds strange, but is genuinely powerful. Allow the discomfort without escaping it. When you sit down to work and the anxiety begins, instead of running from it, name it. Out loud or in writing. I am feeling resistance. My chest is tight. I want to look at my phone. Simply naming an emotion activates the prefrontal cortex, the rational brain, which literally reduces amygdala activation. This is called affect labeling, and it has been demonstrated repeatedly in neuroimaging studies. The act of naming a feeling shrinks its grip on you. The second step is to shrink the reward for avoidance. Make the alternative activities slightly less accessible, slightly less comfortable, slightly more effortful. Not eliminated, just made slightly harder to reach. Because the avoidance relief cycle depends on the alternative being immediately available. A small friction, putting the phone in another room, using an app blocker for 30 minutes, can interrupt the automatic cycle just long enough for you to make a different choice. And the third step, which may be the most important, create a small competing reward for beginning. Not for finishing, for beginning. Tell yourself, if I work on this for 15 minutes, I will have earned something small and genuine. A good cup of tea, a short walk, 5 minutes of something I enjoy. The brain needs to learn that beginning also produces a reward. You are consciously building a new loop to compete with the old one. None of this is magic. None of it will work perfectly the first time. But you are not trying to defeat the dopamine system. You are trying to redirect it. And that is a much more achievable goal. In the next chapter, we need to have an honest conversation about something that wears the costume of high standards. Something that sounds like virtue, but is actually one of the most sophisticated forms of avoidance the human mind has ever constructed. I'm talking about perfectionism, and what it is actually afraid of. Chapter 4. The Perfectionism Trap. Why perfectionism is disguised fear. Imagine two painters standing in front of blank canvases. The first painter picks up the brush and begins. The first strokes are uncertain, maybe even awkward. She makes a mark she doesn't like, paints over it, tries again. An hour later, she has something that is rough and imperfect, but alive. She has a painting. The second painter also stands before his blank canvas. He thinks carefully about what he wants to paint. He reads about technique. He sketches concepts in a notebook. He researches colors. He has long inner conversations with himself about what a truly great painting would look like and whether his skills are ready for that level of ambition. A month later, the canvas is still blank. But he has an extraordinarily detailed vision of the masterpiece he hasn't yet created. We admire the second painter. We say things like, he has high standards. He takes his craft seriously. He doesn't rush. But something darker is happening. The second painter is not actually serving his art. He is serving his fear. And perfectionism is the story he is telling himself so that the fear sounds like something respectable. Let me be precise about what perfectionism actually is, because I think it is almost universally misunderstood, including by the people who have it. Perfectionism is not, at its core, a devotion to quality. It is a strategy for managing the fear of judgment. Specifically, it is based on a deeply held belief, usually unconscious, that if the work is flawed, you will be found to be flawed as well. That your output will be taken as a verdict on your value. That imperfect work is not just disappointing, it is damning. In other words, perfectionism is not about the work. It is about self-protection. The psychologist Brené Brown has written extensively about this distinction. She points out that healthy high standards, what she calls healthy striving, are about doing the work well because you love the work and care about the outcome. Perfectionism, by contrast, is about doing the work perfectly because you are afraid of what people will think and feel if it is less than perfect. Healthy striving asks, how can I improve this? Perfectionism asks, what will people think of me when they see this? The distinction matters enormously because they produce completely different behaviors. A person with healthy standards looks at imperfect work and feels motivated to improve it. A perfectionist looks at imperfect work and feels the urge to hide it, abandon it, or start over. And the ultimate expression of perfectionism, its most extreme and most common form, is not producing work that is too controlled or too refined. It is not producing work at all. Because if the work doesn't exist, it cannot be judged. And if it cannot be judged, you cannot be found wanting. This is the hidden logic of the unstarted novel, the perpetually planned business, the presentation that's almost ready but never quite right. By keeping the work in an ideal state, unbegun, unfinished, still potential, the perfectionist preserves something precious, the belief that if they ever did try, it might be extraordinary. James Allen, the 19th century philosopher, wrote something that cuts right through this. You are today where your thoughts have brought you. You will be tomorrow where your thoughts take you. Perfectionism is a thought pattern, and it takes you precisely nowhere, while making you feel like you're heading somewhere important. Now let me talk about one more dimension of perfectionism that is almost never discussed, because it sits beneath the surface of everything else. Perfectionism is often connected to self-worth, to the belief, usually formed early in life, that love, approval, and value are conditional on performance. Many perfectionists grew up in environments where they were praised, and perhaps only truly praised, when they did something well, where excellence was celebrated and ordinary effort was met with indifference, where the message, delivered explicitly or implicitly, was, you are valued for what you achieve, not for who you are. When this belief is installed in a child, it does not dissolve as they grow. It calcifies, and in adulthood, it produces a person for whom imperfect work is not just disappointing, but existentially threatening. Because if my value is tied to my output, then output that fails to measure up threatens my value itself. This is why telling a perfectionist to just lower your standards is both unhelpful and mildly cruel. Their standards are not the problem. The belief underneath the standards is the problem, and no productivity tip touches that. What does touch it? The first practice is separating identity from output. This is not a one-time insight, but a daily practice. Each time you sit down to work, you are practicing the belief, even if it doesn't feel true yet, that what you produce does not determine what you are worth. You can produce something flawed and remain entirely valuable. You can fail completely at a specific attempt and remain entirely capable of a future attempt. The way to practice this is through deliberate imperfection. Set a timer for 20 minutes and produce something on purpose that is not your best work. Write a paragraph without going back to edit it. Sketch something quickly without refining it. Send an email that is good enough, but not perfect. You are not lowering your standards. You are training your nervous system to survive the experience of imperfection without crisis. The second practice is to reframe the gap. The gap between your vision and your current output is not evidence that you are failing. It is evidence that your taste has outpaced your current skill, and the only way to close that gap is to do the work. Every imperfect attempt moves you closer to the ideal. No attempt keeps you exactly where you are. The third practice, and perhaps the most powerful, is to identify one thing you are going to do today that is good enough. Not perfect, not exceptional, good enough. Then do it. Then let it be done. Let the imperfect thing exist. You will find, with practice, that the world does not end. The judgment you feared either doesn't come or is much milder than predicted. And the amygdala, which was certain disaster awaited, updates its model slightly. Over time, this is how you dismantle the trap. Not through a single breakthrough. Through the accumulated evidence of many survivable imperfections. And there's one more thing worth saying before we leave this chapter. The greatest works of human art, science, and endeavor are not perfect. The Sistine Chapel has sections that Michelangelo considered failures. Darwin's notebooks contain dozens of abandoned theories. Every master has a graveyard of imperfect attempts. What separates them from the perfectionist who never starts is not that they had lower standards. It is that they were willing to produce the imperfect thing on the way to something better. They chose the risk of a visible flaw over the guarantee of an invisible blank. Coming up in the next chapter, we're going to look at something that might be the most seductive trap of all. It's the kind of procrastination that doesn't look like procrastination at all. It looks like diligence. It looks like effort. It even looks like progress. And it is one of the most effective ways the human mind has found to avoid what actually matters. Chapter 5. The Productivity Illusion. Productive procrastination and the fake progress trap. There is a particular kind of person who is astonishingly good at appearing productive. Their desk is immaculate. Their inbox is at zero. Their files are organized with a level of precision that would make a surgeon jealous. They are constantly doing things, important-seeming things, useful-seeming things, tasks that obviously needed to be done. They stay late. They wake early. They are never seen sitting idle. And yet the project that actually matters, the one they have been talking about for 2 years, the one that would genuinely advance their career or fulfill their deepest ambition, that project sits untouched, waiting, forever almost ready. This is productive procrastination. And it is one of the most cunning tricks the avoidance brain has ever invented. Here's why it's so effective. It provides all of the emotional benefits of procrastination: relief from the anxiety of the difficult task, the satisfaction of accomplishment, a sense of forward motion, while completely eliminating its most obvious tell. Nobody calls you lazy. Nobody calls you afraid. You are clearly working. The evidence is all around you. How could you possibly be avoiding something? But being busy is not the same as moving forward. And this distinction is one of the most important things you can learn about how you spend your time. Let's look at the psychology more carefully. When we face a task that triggers fear or anxiety, the meaningful project, the creative work, the difficult conversation, the leap that actually matters, the brain seeks relief. We have established that. What the productive procrastinator has discovered, usually without consciously realizing it, is that certain kinds of alternative activity provide relief with a bonus. They feel legitimate, even virtuous. Answering emails is a real task that needs to be done. Organizing your files is genuinely useful. Doing research for the project is certainly not wasted effort. Improving your website's design, updating your systems, taking a course to improve your skills, all of these have genuine value. The question is not whether these tasks have value. The question is whether doing them now, before the primary work, is a choice made in service of your goals, or a choice made in service of your anxiety. And the answer to that question requires a kind of brutal honesty that most of us find uncomfortable. It requires asking, am I doing this because it genuinely needs to happen now? Or am I doing this because it is easier and less frightening than what I actually need to do? There is a concept in economics called Parkinson's law. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. In the context of productive procrastination, there is a parallel law. Low-stakes work expands to fill all the time available. pushing high-stakes work indefinitely into the future. You could spend the rest of your life optimizing your systems, improving your skills, gathering your resources, and preparing your environment. The preparation is never finished. The conditions are never perfect. And the thing that matters stays undone. William James, who was himself a world-class procrastinator before he found his way out of it, made an observation that I return to often. He said, "Act as if what you do makes a difference." It does. The reverse is also true. Act as if what you prepare will eventually lead to doing. It won't. Not unless the doing is given explicit, non-negotiable priority. Now, I want to be careful here, because I am not saying that preparation is worthless. Research matters. Planning matters. Building skills matters. The question is sequencing and proportion. The healthy version looks like this. You do the primary work first, for a set period. Even if that period is just 20 minutes, and then you attend to the supporting tasks. In this order, the primary work is protected. It is given first claim on your time and energy before the supporting tasks have consumed them both. The productive procrastinator inverts this order. The supporting tasks get the best hours. The primary work gets what's left, which is usually nothing, or the exhausted tail end of the day, or a token 15 minutes before sleep that doesn't produce anything substantial. The way to diagnose whether you are caught in this trap is not complicated, but it does require courage. Look at your last full week. What percentage of your working time was spent on the task that matters most? Not preparing for it, not planning it, not supporting it, actually doing it. If that percentage is low, you have your answer. The practical prescription is what time management researchers call eating the frog, a concept originally borrowed from Mark Twain, who said if you have to eat a frog, do it first thing in the morning, and if you have to eat 2 frogs, eat the bigger one first. But I want to go one step further, because the frog metaphor, while vivid, doesn't explain the why. You do the hardest thing first not because it is a rule, but because it is the only way to protect it from the endlessly patient, endlessly creative avoidance brain. If you leave the important work until later will be colonized by everything else. The supporting work has infinite patience. It will wait until tomorrow. The important work, and more specifically, your energy and courage for it, will not. Here is the exercise. Every day, before you open your email, before you check anything, before you attend to any supporting task, spend 20 minutes. Just 20, on the thing that matters. Not a full session. Just 20 minutes. The purpose is not to finish anything. The purpose is to establish, daily, that the primary work gets the first claim on your attention. Over time, 20 minutes becomes 30. 30 becomes an hour. Not because you forced it, but because the work begins to develop its own momentum. You begin to see progress. Progress is its own motivation. And the supporting tasks, attended to afterward, still get done, because they always do. The productivity illusion is seductive precisely because it is never completely false. The supporting work does have value, but it will never have more value than the thing it is supposed to be supporting. In the next chapter, we are going to confront one of the most persistent myths in the world of personal development, the idea that you need to feel motivated before you can begin. This belief has probably cost more potential than any other single misunderstanding I know of. And the truth, once you understand it, will permanently change how you approach every difficult day. Chapter 6. Why Motivation Keeps Disappearing. The truth about motivation and the neuroscience of momentum. Everyone who has ever tried to change something about their life has had this experience. There is a day, often a specific day, when something shifts. Maybe you heard a talk, or read a book, or had a conversation that landed differently. Or maybe it was a quiet moment of clarity, lying awake in the middle of the night, when you could see with perfect precision what you needed to do and who you needed to become. In that moment, the motivation is overwhelming. It feels like certainty. You feel capable of anything. And then you wake up the next morning, and the feeling is dimmer. Not gone, but dulled. The clarity has softened slightly at the edges. You tell yourself it's still there, you just need to get going. A few days later, it's dimmer still. Within 2 weeks, you can barely locate the feeling at all. And you are left wondering what happened and whether something is fundamentally wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You have simply misunderstood what motivation is. Here is the truth, and it runs exactly counter to what most people believe. Motivation is a result of action, not a prerequisite for it. Let me say that again. Because it matters. Motivation follows action. It does not precede it. This is counterintuitive to the point of feeling wrong. We are culturally trained to believe that you get motivated first and then you act. That if you just wait for the right feeling, the drive, the inspiration, the readiness, then acting will be natural and easy. And so we wait. We wait for the feeling. And the feeling, reliable as weather, comes and goes and comes and goes. And we are carried along by it, productive when it's present, paralyzed when it's not. But here's what neuroscience actually tells us. The brain releases dopamine, the motivation and drive chemical, partly in anticipation of a reward. But it also releases it in response to progress. When you begin a task, when you complete a small step, when you make something that didn't exist before, the brain registers that movement. It releases a small reward. And that reward, small as it is, produces the feeling we call motivation. In other words, you are not supposed to feel motivated before you begin. You are supposed to feel motivated because you began. Researchers have named this the progress principle, after a study led by Teresa Amabile at Harvard Business School. Across thousands of diary entries from workers in creative fields, the single greatest predictor of positive motivation and engagement on any given day was whether the person had made even small progress on meaningful work the previous day. Not breakthroughs, not big wins, just forward movement. The momentum is in the movement itself. This also explains a phenomenon that confuses a lot of people. Why working through resistance often produces a kind of energy that wasn't there at the beginning. You sit down exhausted and reluctant. You force yourself to begin, and 20 minutes later you're engaged and focused in a way you didn't anticipate. This is not magic. This is the dopamine system responding to movement. The engine, once it turns over, produces its own fuel. Now let's talk about discipline, because this is where I think most of the existing advice goes wrong. The standard advice about discipline frames it as the ability to do what you need to do regardless of how you feel. Push through. Override the feeling. Suck it up and do the work. And while there is a version of this that is true and useful, the framing has a problem. It treats emotion as an obstacle to be overcome by force. And most people, most of the time, do not have enough force to sustain that fight indefinitely. Real discipline, the kind that builds over time and becomes genuinely robust, is not about suppressing emotion. It is about decoupling action from emotion. Specifically, it is about developing the habit of beginning the action whether or not the motivating emotion is present. You don't ask, do I feel like doing this today? You ask, is it time to do this today? If the answer to the second question is yes, you begin. The feeling is irrelevant to the decision. It may arrive once you begin, or it may not. Either way, you do the work. This is not a small reframe. For people who are used to riding the wave of motivation when it's present and waiting it out when it's not, this represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between feeling and doing. The philosopher and author Naval Ravikant has pointed out that inspiration is perishable. Act on it immediately. He is pointing to the same truth from a different angle. The window of motivated energy is real but brief. The only way to use it is to act during it, not to preserve the feeling and try to sustain it, but to let it initiate the action and then continue the action independently of whether the feeling persists. There is a concept in physics that serves as a perfect analogy here: the difference between static friction and kinetic friction. Static friction is the force required to get something moving from a standing start. It is always greater than kinetic friction, which is the force required to keep something moving that is already in motion. In other words, it is always harder to begin than to continue. This is why the prescription for almost every procrastination problem is reduce the starting threshold. Make the beginning so small and so easy that the static friction is almost zero. Not because small beginnings produce big results directly, but because they get the thing in motion. And once it is in motion, the continuation is far more sustainable than the start. And one final point on momentum, because it is beautiful and somewhat surprising. Momentum in creative or intellectual work is partly cognitive. When you stop work on something, your brain largely stops processing it. But when you are in the middle of something, when you have stopped mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-project, your brain continues to work on it in the background. This is why writers who stop mid-sentence find it easier to restart than writers who stop at the end of a completed section. The incomplete task keeps the cognitive machinery running at a low hum. The restart is easier because something is already in motion. Use this. Stop in the middle of a sentence. Leave a note for yourself about exactly what comes next. End a work session not at a natural ending point, but in the middle of something you know how to continue. Come back the next day not to a blank slate, but to something that is already moving. Motivation is not the engine. It is the spark that can start the engine. Once running, the engine runs on something more reliable, the habit of showing up and the neurological reward of forward movement. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about something that most people treat as a virtue. A life that is comfortable, safe, and free from unnecessary discomfort. We're going to look at why comfort, in the long run, is not the absence of suffering but the slow accumulation of it, and why the body's deep preference for ease is quietly stealing something you might never get back. Chapter 7. The Comfort Trap. Why comfort slowly steals your potential. There is a principle in biology called the overload principle. It describes what happens when you place greater than usual stress on a biological system. The system responds, over time, by becoming stronger, more efficient, and more capable. The muscle, subjected to more weight than it is used to, repairs itself and grows. The cardiovascular system, pushed to work harder than its baseline, develops greater capacity. The immune system, exposed to manageable doses of pathogens, builds more sophisticated defenses. The principle works in reverse too, and this is the part nobody talks about. A system that is never stressed, that is never placed under demands greater than what it is used to, does not maintain its current capacity. It loses it. The muscle that is never loaded does not stay as it is. It shrinks. The cardiovascular system of a person who is entirely sedentary does not stay at baseline. It deteriorates. Biology, in other words, is not neutral on the question of comfort. It actively punishes sustained comfort with a reduction in capacity, and it rewards productive discomfort with growth. This is not a metaphor. This is physiology, and it applies not just to the body but to the mind. The psychological equivalent of the overload principle operates in exactly the same way. A mind that is consistently challenged, that is asked to do difficult things, to tolerate frustration, to work through uncertainty, to sit with the discomfort of not yet knowing, develops cognitive and emotional capacities that a comfortable mind does not. Resilience, creative problem-solving, the ability to delay gratification, emotional regulation under stress. These are not traits that people are simply born with or without. They are capacities that develop through practice, specifically through the practice of voluntary discomfort. And a mind that is consistently protected from challenge, that is given easy entertainment, comfortable surroundings, stimulation without demand, does not maintain its capacities. They atrophy. The comfort trap works like this. Comfort feels like safety. It feels like rest, and sometimes it is. Genuine rest is important and necessary. But the comfort trap is not rest. It is the ongoing, habitual preference for ease over demand. And it is subtle because it doesn't announce itself as a problem. It announces itself as a reward. You worked hard today. You deserve to relax. True. But 10,000 repetitions of that same sequence. Work slightly, reward greatly, avoid discomfort, seek ease, produces a person who has gradually optimized their life around comfort and gradually abandoned the capacity for challenge. The philosopher Montaigne, who thought deeply about the nature of human happiness, observed, "The thing I fear most is fear." He was pointing to the way that the avoidance of fear, the constant effort to stay comfortable and safe, ultimately produces more fear, not less. Because a person who consistently avoids discomfort becomes increasingly intolerant of it. The threshold drops. Things that are mildly difficult begin to feel overwhelming. The capacity for productive suffering shrinks. This is sometimes called learned helplessness, a concept introduced by the psychologist Martin Seligman in the 1960s. In his original experiments, dogs that had been repeatedly exposed to electric shocks they could not escape stopped trying to escape even when escape became possible. They had learned, through repeated experience, that their actions had no effect on the uncomfortable outcome, and that learning generalized beyond the specific situation that produced it. Even in new situations, where action could have helped, the dogs remained passive. In human beings, learned helplessness develops more subtly, but the mechanism is similar. A person who has spent years protecting themselves from discomfort, avoiding difficult tasks, retreating when things get hard, consistently choosing the easier option, gradually develops the implicit belief that difficult things are not survivable, that the discomfort is unbearable. That beginning is too risky. That failure would be catastrophic. The belief is not a rational conclusion. It is a trained response, but it produces the same result: passivity in the face of difficulty, even when action would genuinely help. Here is the inverse truth, and it is as important as everything else in this chapter. Voluntary discomfort, chosen and endured, builds something that comfort never can. It builds evidence. Evidence that you can survive difficulty. Evidence that discomfort is temporary and manageable. Evidence that you are more capable than the comfortable version of yourself believes. This is why the simple act of doing hard things, not because they are necessary, but by choice, is one of the most powerful psychological practices available. Cold showers, extended focused work sessions, physical challenges, having difficult conversations rather than avoiding them. Not because these specific things are magic, but because they build the evidence base. They teach the nervous system, through direct experience, that discomfort does not equal danger, that hard things can be survived, that you have more capacity than the comfort-seeking part of your brain believes. The ancient Stoics understood this with particular clarity. Seneca recommended deliberate exposure to voluntary hardship precisely for this reason. He would occasionally eat simple food, wear simple clothing, experience minor physical discomfort on purpose, not as punishment, but as training, to demonstrate to himself that he could tolerate adversity without losing himself, and therefore to reduce his fear of adversity occurring. You don't have to be a Stoic to borrow this insight. The practical version is simpler. Every day, do one thing that is slightly outside your comfort zone. Not dramatically uncomfortable, just slightly beyond ease. The specific thing matters less than the habit of reaching beyond comfort as a regular, expected part of your life. What this does, over time, is shift your identity. You stop being someone who prefers ease and begin being someone who can handle difficulty. And identity, as we will see in the next chapter, is the most powerful predictor of behavior there is. Because what you believe you are shapes everything you do. And the gap between where you are and where you want to be is almost always less about capability and more about the story you tell yourself about what kind of person you are. That is where we are going next. Chapter 8. The Identity Conflict. Why goals fail when identity remains unchanged. There is a famous observation from cognitive psychology that goes something like this. People will work very hard to remain consistent with the image they hold of themselves. This is not a minor tendency. It is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. We construct a story about who we are, what kind of person we are, and then we organize our actions, our choices, our habits, and our interpretations of events to remain consistent with that story. And here is the consequence that matters for everything we are discussing. If you set a goal that conflicts with your current identity, the identity will almost always win. Let me give you a very concrete example. Imagine a person who has always thought of themselves as not a morning person. This is part of their identity. They have said it to others. They have explained their behavior with it. They have organized their routines around it. It is part of the story of who they are. Now they decide they want to wake up at 5 in the morning to work on their project before the day begins. They set the alarm. The alarm goes off. And something interesting happens. It is not just that they feel tired. Everyone feels tired at 5 in the morning. It is that somewhere in the groggy pull back towards sleep, their brain registers a conflict. This is not what someone like me does. And the identity exerts its gravity. The alarm is silenced. The project doesn't happen. This is not weakness. This is identity consistency, working exactly as designed. The psychologist and author James Clear describes this beautifully. He points out that most people think about changing their habits by changing their outcomes. They want different results. Some go deeper and try to change their processes. They want different systems. But neither of these approaches touches the deepest level, which is identity, who they believe they are. Outcome-based thinking says, I want to write a book. Process-based thinking says, I will write every morning for an hour. Identity-based thinking says, I am a writer. The third approach is radically different from the first two because it anchors the behavior to something permanent, a self-conception, rather than something contingent, like a goal or a schedule. When you identity level believe that you are a particular kind of person, the associated behaviors feel natural, consistent, even automatic. A person who genuinely believes they are healthy doesn't decide every day whether to eat well. They just do it because that's what someone like them does. A person who genuinely believes they are disciplined doesn't wrestle every morning with whether to begin work. They begin because that's what their kind of person does. Conversely, when you attempt behaviors that conflict with your current identity, the conflict is palpable. It requires constant willpower to maintain. And willpower, as we've established, is not an infinite resource. Now here is where this gets interesting, and where most books on identity stop prematurely. They tell you to simply adopt a new identity. Decide you are a writer. Decide you are a disciplined person. Decide you are someone who exercises, as if the decision itself creates the new self. But the brain doesn't work that way. The brain is an evidence-gathering machine. It updates beliefs about identity based on accumulated evidence, on the record of what you have actually done. You cannot simply decide you are something you have no evidence of being. The brain will not accept the claim. What you can do is build the evidence. Every time you sit down to write, even for 10 minutes, you are adding one data point to the evidence base that says, I am someone who writes. Every time you begin when you don't want to, you add a data point that says, I am someone who follows through. Every time you choose the harder thing, you add to the evidence that says, I am someone who can handle difficulty. The identity doesn't change before the behavior. The identity changes because of the behavior, slowly, through accumulated evidence. This is why tiny actions matter so disproportionately to their immediate output. A 10-minute writing session doesn't produce a book, but it produces a vote in the election that determines who you are for the version of yourself that is a writer. Cast enough votes, and that candidate wins. James Allen expressed a version of this truth more than a century ago. Men are anxious to improve their circumstances, but are unwilling to improve themselves. They therefore remain bound. The circumstances he was pointing to include not just external conditions, but internal ones: the identity, the self-conception, the story we tell ourselves about what we are capable of. To improve circumstances, you must improve yourself. To improve yourself, you must act as the improved version before the improvement feels complete. And you must do this consistently enough and long enough for the evidence to shift the identity. Here is the practical entry point to all of this. Start with a very small behavioral claim. Not, I am a writer, if you haven't written in years. Instead, I am someone who writes a few sentences every morning. This is a claim your brain can test immediately. You write a few sentences. The claim is confirmed. The identity shifts, even fractionally. Tomorrow you do it again. The shift becomes slightly less fractional. After 30 days, the claim, I am someone who writes every morning, is no longer aspirational. It is simply accurate. And from there, you can expand the claim, I am someone who writes. And eventually, with enough evidence, I am a writer. The shift in identity is not the beginning of the process. It is the end of it. The beginning is the tiny behavioral proof. This is also the answer to one of the most common forms of confusion around procrastination. I know what I need to do. I just can't make myself do it. The reason you can't make yourself do it is that the behavior conflicts with your current identity. You are not yet someone who does that thing. And the solution is not to try harder. It is to begin building the evidence, one small, repeated action at a time, that shifts who you are. Coming up in the next chapter, we are going to talk about a fear that is almost never named, even by the people who are most controlled by it. You've heard of fear of failure, but there's a companion to it that operates in the shadows, and in some ways is even more powerful. It's the fear that lives not in the possibility of things going wrong, but in the possibility of things going extraordinarily right. Chapter 9. The fear nobody talks about. Fear of success, change, and responsibility. I want to tell you about a pattern that shows up again and again in the lives of highly capable people, and that almost nobody acknowledges directly. It goes like this: someone has a genuine opportunity, an opportunity that is real, that they have prepared for, that they are in fact capable of taking. And at the exact moment when success is within reach, something happens. Not a practical obstacle, an internal one. Inexplicably, they begin to underperform. They miss a deadline. They pick a fight. They develop a sudden new interest that pulls their focus away. They somehow manage to make the outcome less successful than it could have been. And then, Crucially, they explain it in terms of failure. I dropped the ball. I wasn't ready. Something came up. They locate the explanation in the external or in personal inadequacy. What they don't do is ask the more uncomfortable question, did some part of me engineer this? This phenomenon, which psychologists call self-handicapping, or in its more complex form, fear of success, is one of the most counterintuitive things about human psychology. And understanding it requires being honest about what success actually entails. Success is not just achievement. It comes bundled with other things that are genuinely difficult. Success changes relationships. When you succeed significantly, when you cross into a different level of achievement from the people around you, things shift. Some people become inspired by you. Others become resentful, even people who loved you before. Some relationships grow stronger. Others cannot survive the imbalance. The social landscape of your life changes, and there is no way to know in advance exactly how it will change. Success changes expectations. Once you have demonstrated capability at a higher level, that level becomes the new baseline. Other people's expectations rise. But more critically, your own expectations rise. You are no longer allowed the comfort of saying, I haven't really tried yet. You have tried. You have demonstrated. And now the question is, can you sustain it? Can you repeat it? Can you continue to live up to what you have shown yourself to be capable of? Success changes identity. The version of yourself that exists after a significant achievement is not the same as the version that existed before. And the gap between who you are now and who you will become can be frightening, even if you want the outcome. Marianne Williamson, in a passage that has been widely quoted, described our deepest fear not as our inadequacy, but as our power. The fear that we are more capable than we have been willing to admit. That if we fully expressed that capability, we would be visible in a way that feels dangerous. Here is what this looks like neurologically. The amygdala, our threat detector, responds not just to current threats, but to anticipated ones. When you are on the edge of significant success, the brain models forward. What happens next? And what it sees is not just a pleasant outcome. It sees change, uncertainty, new demands, new risks, new vulnerabilities. The unfamiliar territory of a life that has changed. And the amygdala responds to anticipated unfamiliarity exactly as it responds to anticipated danger. The result is a pullback, not always conscious, often disguised as laziness, or bad luck, or circumstances. But operating underneath all of that, the avoidance mechanism engages. The task gets harder to complete. The energy for the final push is mysteriously absent. Something more pressing materializes. Now let me talk about a closely related phenomenon, fear of judgment. Not just judgment from failure, which we've discussed, but judgment from success. In many social environments, high achievement is quietly punished. There is a term for it in different cultures. In Japanese, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The person who succeeds, who stands out, who achieves more than the people around them, often experiences social friction that the ordinary achiever does not. Envy, cooling of relationships, subtle or not so subtle pressure to return to the mean. For people who grew up in environments where being too successful was socially costly, or where achievement drew unwanted attention, or where visible success meant a loss of belonging, the fear of success is not abstract. It is learned. The amygdala has actual historical data that says, big achievement equals social cost. And it uses that data to discourage repetition. What do you do with this? The first step is recognition. You cannot address a fear you haven't named. So the practice here is to honestly ask yourself, is there any part of me that is afraid of what success would mean? Not just what failure would mean, but what success would mean. What would change? What would be demanded of me? What would I have to give up or give into? Sometimes simply naming this fear, specifically and honestly, removes a significant part of its power. The brain has been operating on a vague threat. When you articulate the specific content of the threat, you can evaluate it rationally. And often, when you evaluate it rationally, you find that the feared outcomes are either less likely than anticipated or more manageable than they seemed in the shadows. The second step is a practice of deliberate exposure to responsibility. If you fear the weight of success, take on a slightly heavier weight voluntarily. Let something small. Commit to something publicly. Finish something and let it be seen. Each time you survive the added responsibility, each time the weight doesn't crush you, the amygdala updates. Responsibility becomes slightly less threatening. The unfamiliar becomes slightly more familiar. And the third step is to clearly separate the values and relationships that are core to who you are from the superficial arrangements that might change with success. The fear of success often contains the hidden fear of losing what matters. When you are clear about what genuinely matters, and you recognize that those things are not actually threatened by your achievement, the fear loses its most powerful argument. You are allowed to become. You are allowed to succeed so thoroughly that your life changes shape. The people who genuinely love you will not require you to stay small to maintain the relationship. And the relationships that require your smallness are not relationships you can afford to preserve at the cost of your potential. In the next chapter, we are going to look at something that is making all of this dramatically worse. Something that has flooded the modern world in the last 15 years and fundamentally altered the way the human brain processes attention, reward, and difficulty. It has made avoidance easier, starting harder, and the gap between where we are and where we want to be wider than it has ever been in human history. Chapter 10. The Modern Brain Under Attack. Social media, dopamine overload, and attention fragmentation. In 2007, the average human attention span in a task-focused context was measured at approximately 12 minutes. By 2015, it had dropped to around 8 minutes. By some estimates, in the mid-2020s, it sits closer to 4 or 5 minutes before the impulse to switch attention becomes overwhelming. That is not a personal failing. That is the measured, documented effect of what happens to the brain under conditions of sustained overstimulation. And the primary driver of that overstimulation is something most of us interact with dozens of times a day, every day, without meaningful pause. To understand what is happening neurologically with social media and attention-fragmenting technology, we need to return to dopamine, but with an important addition to what we discussed earlier. The dopamine system was designed to respond to rewards in a world where rewards were relatively rare and required real effort. A meal was a reward that required significant effort to obtain. A successful social interaction was meaningful. The discovery of something new was important information. The system was calibrated for a world of effort and intermittent reward. What social media platforms have done, and this is not accidental, it is by deliberate design, is create an environment where dopamine-triggering stimuli arrive in an unbroken stream. New notifications, new content, new reactions to your posts, new information, new controversy to engage with. The stream never ends, because the platforms are specifically engineered to identify what triggers your dopamine system and serve you more of it. The result of sustained exposure to this environment is a recalibration of the dopamine system. The baseline moves. The ordinary rewards of ordinary effort. The slow satisfaction of progressing on a difficult project. The quiet pleasure of focused work. The modest reward of learning something incrementally. These become less compelling because they are so much less stimulating than the continuous high-intensity dopamine hits the platform provides. In other words, sustained use of attention fragmentation technology makes meaningful work feel more boring, more effortful, and less rewarding than it naturally would. It doesn't just compete with your work for time. It actively reshapes your brain's capacity to find satisfaction in the work itself. The neuroscientist Anna Lemke, who has written extensively on dopamine and addiction, describes this as a kind of anhedonia, a difficulty experiencing pleasure from ordinary activities, produced not by a single addictive substance, but by the sustained overstimulation of the reward system. The brain, flooded with dopamine triggers, downregulates its own dopamine receptors to maintain equilibrium. And when the stimulation is removed, when you sit down to do something that doesn't produce constant novelty, the underlying level of reward responsiveness is lower than it would naturally be. The work feels dry. The progress feels slow. The satisfaction that should come from focused effort is muted. And in response, almost automatically, the brain reaches for the stimulation it has been trained to expect. This creates a loop that is devastating for anyone trying to build something over time. The behavior most required for meaningful achievement, sustained, focused, deep work over extended periods, is exactly the behavior most impaired by regular exposure to high stimulation, attention-fragmenting platforms. And here is the part that nobody who sells you productivity tools ever tells you. This is not a time management problem. You could have a perfect schedule, a perfect system, a perfect accountability partner. But if your dopamine system has been recalibrated by sustained overstimulation, the problem isn't how you arrange your time. The problem is that your brain has forgotten how to find ordinary effort satisfying. There is also the effect of social comparison. Social platforms provide continuous information about what other people are doing, achieving, experiencing, and displaying. And human beings, who evolved in small groups where social comparison was limited to the people you could physically see, are not equipped to process comparison at the scale that social platforms provide. The result is a constant, low-level awareness of inadequacy. Someone else is further ahead. Someone else is more successful. Someone else seems to be effortlessly achieving the things you are struggling to begin. This awareness doesn't primarily produce motivation. I'll work harder to close the gap. Primarily, it produces discouragement, shame, and a very particular kind of paralysis that looks exactly like procrastination. The practical response to all of this operates on multiple levels. The first and most important is structural. Create protected periods of time that are completely free of attention-fragmenting technology. Not just the phone in your pocket, the phone in another room. Not just notifications off, the app deleted or locked. The key is physical and structural separation, because willpower applied against a constant temptation will eventually fail. Remove the temptation from the environment rather than relying on willpower to resist it. The second is what some researchers call a dopamine fast, a period of deliberately reduced stimulation to allow the reward system to recalibrate toward its natural baseline. This doesn't mean asceticism. It means recognizing that your brain's ability to find ordinary work satisfying is a resource that can be depleted and restored. It is depleted by continuous overstimulation. It is restored by periods of relative quiet. The third is the deliberate practice of sustained attention on something that rewards sustained attention. Reading long-form books, listening to music without doing anything else, working on a difficult problem for an extended period without switching. These activities train the attention system the way exercise trains the body. They rebuild the capacity for the kind of focus that meaningful work requires. The philosopher of the digital age, if we can call him that, is the computer scientist Cal Newport, who has argued that the capacity for deep, focused, sustained work is becoming simultaneously rarer and more valuable. Rarer, because the technological environment we live in actively erodes it. More valuable, because the meaningful outcomes of modern life require it. To protect your attention in the current environment is an act of extraordinary self-respect. It is to say, this capacity, the ability to focus, to think deeply, to sustain effort, is mine, and I will not allow it to be colonized by systems designed to profit from its erosion. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about the antidote to all of this, about how the brain changes, physically, measurably, structurally, in response to small, consistent actions, about why you don't need dramatic transformation to start moving toward the life you want. You need something much smaller, much more manageable, and much more surprising. Chapter 11. Tiny Actions, Massive Change. Neuroplasticity, Habit Rewiring, and the Power of Starting Small. In 1949, a Canadian neuropsychologist named Donald Hebb proposed a principle that would become one of the foundational ideas of modern neuroscience. He stated it simply: neurons that fire together, wire together. What he meant is this: when two neurons activate simultaneously, repeatedly, the connection between them strengthens. The synaptic gap between them, the space across which the signal must jump, becomes more efficient, more easily traversed. The signal flows faster, more automatically, with less effort. Over time, if a pattern of neural activation is repeated frequently enough, it becomes what we now call a habit. Not just a behavioral habit, but a neural one. A deeply embedded pathway of activation in the brain that can be triggered with minimal conscious input, that runs automatically, that operates below the level of deliberate decision-making. This is the neurological basis of habit. And once you understand it, you understand two things simultaneously: why bad habits are so hard to break, and why good ones are so possible to build. The crucial word in Hebb's principle is together. Neurons wire together when they fire together. The connection is formed not by the content of the signal, but by the repetition of the co-activation. In other words, what you do repeatedly, your brain learns to do automatically. Not just more easily, automatically. This means that every tiny action you take in the direction of what you want to become is not just a small step toward a goal. It is a small investment in a neural pathway. And neural pathways, once established, become your defaults. They become who you are without having to choose to be that person. This is why starting small is not a fallback option for people who can't manage bigger effort. It is, neurologically, the most intelligent strategy available. Consider how a neural pathway is built. You take an action. The associated neurons activate. If the action produces a result, any result, even a tiny one, the reward system provides a small signal. The pathway is marginally reinforced. The next time a similar situation arises, the activation of those neurons requires slightly less activation energy. The pathway is slightly more accessible. Repeat this 100 times. The pathway is well established. Repeat it 1,000 times. It is deeply rooted. The behavior that required conscious effort and decision-making at the beginning now flows almost without decision. You sit down and begin, not because you decided to, but because that is what you do. This is the mechanism behind what people call second nature. Second nature is not a metaphor. It is a description of an alternate nature that has been built through repetition, a neural architecture that makes certain behaviors feel natural, automatic, effortless. And here is the thing about this mechanism that is at once obvious and deeply counterintuitive. The size of the initial action has almost no relationship to the strength of the eventual habit. What determines the strength of the habit is the consistency and frequency of the repetition. 2 minutes of writing every morning, done faithfully for a year, builds a stronger, writer, neural pathway than 3 hours of writing done sporadically whenever motivation strikes. Not because the 2-minute sessions are more productive, because the consistent repetition, the reliable co-activation of those particular neurons in response to the same morning context, does more to establish the automatic pattern. This is what I mean when I say that starting small is not about small results. It is about large changes to the neural architecture that governs behavior. The researcher B.J. Fogg, who has studied behavior change for decades at Stanford, has articulated what he calls the tiny habits method. The core insight is that behavior change is most durable when it is easiest, when the action required is so small that it requires almost no willpower, almost no motivation, almost no special conditions. The small action gets done reliably, and through that reliability, the neural pathway is formed. And the pathway, once formed, allows larger and larger actions to be attached to it, because the foundational automatic pattern is now in place. Fogg identifies 3 elements required for a behavior to occur: motivation, ability, and a prompt. Of these, motivation is the most unreliable, as we've established. Ability can be engineered. Making the action smaller makes it more within your ability. And the prompt can be designed, attaching the new action to something that already happens reliably in your environment. In practice, you don't start a writing habit by deciding to write every morning. You start by deciding that after your first cup of coffee, which you already make every morning, you will open your notebook and write 1 sentence. The prompt is the coffee. The action is 1 sentence. The ability required is nearly 0. The motivation required is minimal. The result, over time, is a writer's neural pathway. There is a complementary insight from the neuroscience of mindfulness and cognitive flexibility. The prefrontal cortex, the rational, planning, self-directing part of the brain, can be strengthened through practice. Specifically, the practice of noticing your own mental states, choosing a direction deliberately, and sustaining that choice against competing impulses. This is the neural foundation of what we call self-regulation. And like any neural capacity, it grows through use. Every time you notice the impulse to procrastinate and choose differently, even in a tiny way, even for 5 minutes, you are exercising the prefrontal cortex in exactly the way that strengthens it. Not dramatically, but measurably and cumulatively. The implication is important. You cannot build self-regulation by trying to be perfectly disciplined. You build it by repeatedly, consistently noticing the impulse to avoid and choosing a small action instead. The regulation grows through the practice of small, survived acts of direction. One last element of this chapter, because it is often missed. The brain does not only wire in response to actions you take. It also wires in response to actions you visualize in sufficient detail. Visualization, done with enough specificity and emotional engagement, activates many of the same neural pathways as actually performing the visualized action. This is why athletes use visualization, not as a motivational technique, but as a training technique. They are building and reinforcing neural pathways. For our purposes, spending 3 minutes vividly imagining yourself beginning and completing the specific action you intend to take, imagining it in sensory detail, imagining the context, the feel, the process, primes those pathways before you physically act. When you then sit down to do the thing, the neural path is marginally more established than if you had jumped in cold. This is not magic. It is priming. And in combination with consistent small action, it accelerates the formation of the neural architecture that will eventually make your desired behavior feel natural. The brain you have today is not the brain you are committed to. Every small, consistent action changes it. And the changed brain changes what feels possible and natural and automatic. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about how all of this connects to the long arc of becoming someone who finishes. Someone who not only starts, but sustains. Someone who does not abandon the work when the first enthusiasm dims. Someone whose relationship with their own commitments is one of trust, both directions. Chapter 12. Becoming the person who finishes. Building consistency, emotional resilience, and self-trust. Of all the things people struggle with in the arena of procrastination and avoidance, the most painful might be this. They know what they need to do, they have done it before, and they still can't seem to do it consistently. This is the experience of the person who starts and stops, who has momentum for 3 weeks and then loses it, who builds a routine, breaks it once, and then can't seem to reconstruct it, who has had versions of themselves that were disciplined and consistent and can't understand why the current version falls short. There's a name for what is actually happening here, and it's not the name most people give it. They call it weakness, or lack of discipline, or just being the kind of person who can't maintain things. But what it actually is, in almost every case, is something much more specific and much more solvable: a broken relationship with self-trust. Self-trust is the accumulation of evidence that you do what you say you are going to do. Not to other people, to yourself. Every time you make a commitment to yourself and keep it, the self-trust account gains a deposit. Every time you make a commitment to yourself and break it, the account makes a withdrawal. And over time, the balance of that account determines what you believe you are capable of. A person with a high self-trust balance approaches new commitments with confidence. They have a track record. The internal evidence says, when I decide to do something, I do it. The belief is grounded. The attempt is made from a stable foundation. A person with a depleted self-trust account approaches new commitments with a quiet doubt that they often can't explain. They feel genuinely motivated at the moment of deciding. But beneath the motivation, in the background, the evidence is whispering. You've said this before. You've decided this before. And here you are again. The doubt is not pessimism. It is pattern recognition. The solution, the only solution, in my experience, is to make small commitments that you actually keep. Not impressive commitments. Not the commitment that will fix everything. The commitment that is so small it is almost embarrassing to name, but that you will actually do. If you have a history of promising yourself you'll write an hour every day and then writing for 3 days before stopping, the right next commitment is not another hour a day promise. It is a 5-minute promise, or a 1-sentence promise. Something so small that breaking it would require active effort. Something that, even on your worst day, you can actually do. And then you keep it. For 30 days. Not because 30 days is a magic number. Because 30 days of kept promises deposits 30 units of self-trust. And 30 units of self-trust changes the internal evidence. The quiet doubt starts to be countered by actual data. This is what emotional resilience looks like in practice. Not the Hollywood version. Not stoic toughness or the absence of discomfort. Real emotional resilience is the capacity to continue functioning in the presence of discomfort, setback, and uncertainty. And that capacity is built the same way every other capacity is built, through repeated small practice under manageable conditions. Every time you sit down to work when you don't want to, you are practicing emotional resilience. Every time you push through the first 15 minutes of resistance and find that the work becomes manageable, you are depositing evidence into the bank of self-knowledge. Discomfort is survivable. Resistance is not a stop sign. There is also something deeply important about how you respond to the inevitable breaks in consistency, because they will happen. You will miss a day. You will have a week where the routine collapses. Life will intervene in ways you didn't plan for, and the streak will end. What you do at that moment is disproportionately important to the long-term outcome. The most common response is catastrophizing. The routine is broken. The momentum is lost. I've proven again that I can't maintain things. I might as well wait until the circumstances are better and start again. This response treats a single missed day as evidence of identity, as proof that you are the kind of person who stops. And because identity, as we've established, is the most powerful predictor of behavior, that conclusion becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more useful response, the one that high-consistency people have developed, often through painful trial and error, is the rule of never miss twice. Missing once is an event. Missing twice is the beginning of a pattern. The first miss is forgiven immediately, without negotiation, without judgment. The only question is, how do I return tomorrow? The researcher and author David Goggins talks about a concept he calls the accountability mirror, the practice of being rigorously honest with yourself about the difference between who you are and who you claim to be. Not in a spirit of self-punishment, but in a spirit of radical honesty that creates the motivation to close the gap. You look at yourself and say, here is what I said I would do. Here is what I actually did. Here is what I am going to do differently. This is not the same as self-criticism. Self-criticism says, you are bad because you fell short. Accountability says, you fell short, and the shortfall is information. What does it tell you about what needs to change? The person who finishes is not someone who never struggles. They are someone who has developed a particular relationship with struggle. They don't take it as a signal to stop. They take it as a signal to adjust. And there is one more component of finishing that is worth naming explicitly: the relationship with boredom. The middle of any project, after the excitement of beginning and before the satisfaction of completion, is often boring. This is the stage where most people abandon things. The initial enthusiasm has faded. The end is not yet visible. The work is just work, day after day, requiring effort without the reward of novelty or completion. Tolerating this middle distance is a skill, and like all skills, it is developed through practice. The practice is simply staying, not because you feel like it, not because it's exciting, but because you said you would, and because you know that the feeling of boredom is not a sign that the work has become worthless. It is a sign that the work has become ordinary. And ordinary work, done with consistency, produces extraordinary outcomes over time. In our final chapter before the closing, we are going to put all of this together. Every thread, the neuroscience, the identity, the fear, the dopamine, the habits, they all connect in a complete picture of how the avoidance loop can be broken. Not by willpower, by design, by understanding, and by a set of practices that work with the brain instead of against it. Chapter 13. The End of the Avoidance Loop. A complete framework for breaking procrastination permanently. We have traveled a long way together through this book. And before we synthesize everything into a complete picture, I want to acknowledge something. If you have been reading this and recognizing yourself in every chapter, if you have felt, repeatedly, the specific sting of this is exactly what I do, then I want you to know that the recognition itself is significant. Not everyone has the self-awareness to see themselves clearly in these patterns. The fact that you can see them is the beginning of everything else. Now let us build the complete framework. The avoidance loop is not a single problem. It is a system, a network of interconnected mechanisms, each of which reinforces the others. To break it permanently, you need to address the system, not just one element of it. Attacking one piece while leaving the others intact is why most productivity interventions only work temporarily. Here is the system in its entirety, and here is what you do about each part. The first element is the threat response. Meaningful work triggers the amygdala because it is associated with possibility of failure, judgment, and loss of self-worth. The amygdala responds to unfamiliarity and imagined danger. The intervention: reduce the scope of action until the threat response does not activate. Make the task so small that the brain cannot summon a proportionate threat response. Open the file. Write one sentence. Make one call. Do the smallest possible version of the next step. Do this until beginning no longer activates the alarm. The second element is the relief reward. Avoidance produces immediate emotional relief. Relief is registered as a reward. The reward reinforces the avoidance. The loop strengthens with each repetition. The intervention, interrupt the loop before relief can be registered. The moment you notice the impulse to avoid, the moment the phone becomes interesting or the alternative activity becomes compelling, name the feeling. Out loud if possible. I am feeling resistance. I want to avoid this. The act of naming activates the prefrontal cortex and reduces the amygdala signal. Then take the smallest possible action on the actual task. The relief that would have come from avoidance is now replaced, in small part, by the satisfaction of having acted. The third element is the identity conflict. If you do not currently see yourself as someone who begins difficult things, completes meaningful work, and follows through on commitments, then every attempt to do those things runs against the current of your self-conception. The intervention, build identity through small, consistent behavioral evidence. Every morning, one small action, one sentence, one step, one proof. Over weeks and months, the evidence accumulates. The identity updates. What was an act of will becomes an expression of who you are. The fourth element is the dopamine recalibration. Sustained exposure to high stimulation, low-effort technology has raised the baseline stimulation threshold, making ordinary effort feel less rewarding than it naturally would. The intervention, structural separation from attention-fragmenting technology during primary work periods. Protected deep work sessions. Deliberate periods of lower stimulation to allow the reward system to recalibrate. Gradual rebuilding of the capacity to find ordinary effort satisfying. The fifth element is perfectionism and fear. The fear of judgment, the fear of imperfection, and in some cases the fear of success, create a deep reluctance to produce work that is visible, evaluable, and real. The intervention, deliberate production of imperfect work, daily, not as a lowering of standards, but as a practice of separating self-worth from output. Done in small doses, over time, the evidence accumulates that imperfect work does not produce catastrophe. The fear diminishes through survived exposure. The sixth element is the motivation myth. Waiting for the feeling of motivation to arrive before acting, which produces a passive, reactive relationship with your own behavior. The intervention, act regardless of the emotional state. The action produces the motivation, not the other way around. Use the 2-minute rule, the tiny habit anchor, the first things first discipline. Begin the action. Trust the momentum to arrive once the action is underway. The seventh element is productive procrastination. The elaborate replacement of the primary work with legitimate but secondary tasks, producing the feeling of productivity without the reality of progress on what matters. The intervention, protect the first 20 minutes of every work period for the primary work. Before email, before administrative tasks, before anything else. 20 minutes of primary work before anything else. This simple sequence, practiced daily, ensures that the primary work gets the first claim on attention and energy every day rather than the last. And the eighth and final element of the system is the self-trust deficit. The accumulation of broken internal commitments that produces the quiet doubt that undermines every new attempt. The intervention, small promises kept reliably for an extended period. Not the promise that will fix everything, the promise so small that keeping it requires almost no effort. Keep it anyway. Keep it for 30 days. Watch the self-trust account begin to fill. Let the balance grow until the internal evidence changes from, "You've tried this before," to "You do what you say you will do." These 8 interventions together form a system that addresses the avoidance loop at every point where it operates. You don't need to do all of them simultaneously at maximum intensity. You need to understand all of them well enough to recognize which one is most relevant to where you are right now, and then to begin there. Because the beginning is always the same, regardless of how much you understand about the system. You pick up the pen. You open the document. You make the call. You take the first tiny step. And now let me say something that is true and that all the neuroscience in the world confirms. The brain you will have after 6 months of small, consistent action is not the same brain you have today. The neural pathways will be different. The identity will be different. The evidence base, what you know yourself to be capable of, will be fundamentally different. This is not metaphor. This is neuroplasticity. This is the architecture of your nervous system changing in response to what you repeatedly do. The philosopher William James, who wrestled with his own profound inertia for years before finding his way out of it, said something I want to leave with you as we enter the final chapter. The great use of life is to spend it for something that will outlast it. The thing that will outlast you, the project, the work, the contribution, it is waiting. Not for the right conditions, not for perfect readiness, not for the fear to disappear or the motivation to be sufficient or the identity to fully transform. It is waiting for one small beginning, and then another, and then another. This final chapter is about that, about the person you are becoming, one small repeated action at a time, and what that person might eventually build. I want to tell you a different version of David's story. You remember David, the man who wanted to write a novel, who had started and stopped 4 times across 4 different years, who could not explain to himself why he kept circling the same dream without landing on it. Here is what happened to David 18 months after the worst of his avoidance. He was having one of those nights, the kind that used to spiral into despair, lying awake at 2 in the morning, unable to silence the part of his mind that calculated all the years he'd lost and all the pages he'd never written. And something shifted, not dramatically, not with a thunderclap of insight. He just got tired. Tired in a very specific way. He got tired of the version of himself that spent more energy managing the fear of failing than he would ever have spent simply writing the imperfect thing. He got up. He went to his desk. He wrote a paragraph. It was not good. He knew it wasn't good. He wrote another paragraph. Also not particularly good. He went back to bed. In the morning, the file was still open. He wrote for 10 minutes before work. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't make any promises. He didn't set up an accountability system or declare a public commitment or redesign his schedule. He just wrote for 10 minutes. He did this for 3 weeks. The writing was inconsistent in quality. Some mornings it was worse than what a teenager might produce. Some mornings it surprised him. He kept going regardless. At the end of a year, David had something he had never had before. Not a finished novel. He was perhaps halfway through a first draft that would need significant revision. But something more important, evidence. Evidence that he was someone who showed up. Evidence that the fear, which had seemed for years like an absolute barrier, was actually just a sensation. Uncomfortable, but survivable. Evidence that the work, which he had imagined would have to be perfect before he could bear to look at it, could be imperfect and still be there. Still be something. He was not the same person who had lain awake at 2 in the morning feeling the weight of all the years. He was someone different. Not dramatically, visibly different. He looked roughly the same. His life circumstances hadn't changed radically, but in the way that matters most, in what he believed himself to be capable of, in what he expected of himself, in what he knew about his own relationship with difficulty, he was fundamentally changed. That is the promise of this book, not the dramatic transformation, the quiet, incremental, real one. Now I want to talk about your future self, because this is where psychology has given us something genuinely useful. Research in psychology has found that most people relate to their future self the way they relate to a stranger. The person you will be in 10 years feels remote, abstract, almost fictional. And because they feel like a stranger, the brain doesn't place the same moral weight on commitments to them as it places on commitments to current relationships. The future self can wait. The present self has needs now. This is one of the mechanisms behind long-term procrastination. The cost of avoidance is borne not by the person deciding to avoid, but by the future person who inherits the consequences of that decision. And since the future person feels like a stranger, the cost doesn't register with the same urgency as the present benefit. The intervention is to make the future self feel more real. This is not abstract advice. There is a specific practice. Write a letter, long or short, to the person you will be in 1 year if you make the changes you know you need to make. Describe their life. Describe what they know, what they have built, how they feel about the work they've done. Make them vivid. Give them specificity. And then ask, what does this person need from you today? Not in a year. Today. When the future self becomes vivid, when they stop being a stranger and start being someone you feel responsibility toward, the calculus shifts. The decision to avoid becomes not just a personal indulgence, but a theft from a real person. Someone who deserves the accumulated effort of today's small actions. And here is the philosophical dimension I want to close with. because I think it matters more than any of the practical techniques. The ancient Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who was also, not coincidentally, the emperor of Rome and a man with very little shortage of things to avoid, wrote in his private journal, in a passage not meant for anyone but himself, "Confine yourself to the present." He was not giving productivity advice. He was pointing to something deeper. The weight we carry when we procrastinate is not just the weight of the undone thing. It is the accumulated weight of every past avoidance combined with every anticipated future avoidance. It is the entirety of the gap, the distance between who we are and who we believe we could be, all felt at once, in the present moment, before we have done anything about it. The way out of that weight is not to solve the entire problem. It is to confine yourself to the present action. What can be done in the next 10 minutes? Not in the next year. The next 10 minutes. What is one small thing you can do, right now, in the direction of what matters? That is the only question that has ever changed anything. The author and philosopher James Allen wrote, in his remarkable short book As a Man Thinketh, "He who has conquered doubt and fear has conquered failure." I want to update that slightly for what we now know about the brain. He who has acted in the presence of doubt and fear, who has not conquered them but moved through them, has begun to build the evidence that failure is not the end, that the fear was manageable, and that beginning was always within reach. You do not need to conquer the fear. You need to act alongside it, so many times that the fear becomes familiar, and the familiar eventually becomes ordinary, and the ordinary eventually becomes who you are. There is a word I have been avoiding using throughout this book, because it is so frequently used carelessly. The word is courage. I have avoided it because it is too often used to suggest that the person who procrastinates lacks something, some innate quality called courage that other, better people possess. And that framing is both false and cruel. But I want to reclaim the word, because used correctly it describes something true and important. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the willingness to act in the presence of fear when the action matters. It is not a permanent character trait that some people have and others don't. It is a practice. It is what you are doing every time you begin despite resistance. Every time you write the imperfect paragraph. Every time you make the call you were dreading. Every time you sit down for the 10 minutes, even when every part of you wants to find something easier. Each of those moments is a small act of courage. And those small acts of courage are the building blocks of a life that means something. Here is what I want to leave you with. The person you want to become, the version of you that has done the work, built the thing, taken the risk, shown up consistently. They are not waiting for different circumstances. They are not waiting for more time, or more talent, or better conditions. They are waiting for exactly one thing. For you to begin. Not perfectly, not fearlessly, not with full certainty that it will work. Just to begin, in the messy, uncertain, imperfect way that all real beginnings happen. The neuroscience tells us that the brain changes in response to what we repeatedly do. The psychology tells us that identity is built through evidence. The philosophy tells us that the present moment is all we ever actually have. And the wisdom of every person who has ever made something meaningful, writers, scientists, artists, entrepreneurs, parents, teachers, builders of all kinds, tells us that the work was never waiting for the conditions to be perfect. The conditions were always imperfect. The work happened anyway. And in the happening, the person changed. Not from weakness to strength in a single dramatic transformation, but from someone who intended to begin to someone who began. And then again, and again, until beginning was no longer the question. Until the question was just, what comes next? You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not someone for whom this doesn't apply, or someone too damaged by old patterns to change. You are a person with a brain that is doing exactly what brains do, protecting you from anticipated discomfort, seeking immediate relief, running the software of 1,000,000 years of evolution in a world that has changed faster than evolution can follow. And you are also a person who read this book, who recognized yourself, who felt the particular ache of understanding why the thing you most want keeps slipping away, and who is, right now, in this moment, one decision away from a different kind of day. Make the decision, not the big one, the small one. Open the file, write the first line, put on the shoes, make the call, take out the instrument, begin the sketch, send the first message, take the first step, and then do it again tomorrow. and again the day after that. The person who finishes is just the person who kept beginning. Be that person. You already know how.